What I'm going to talk about today is LifeSize's idea, which we're calling Smart Video, and the presentation today is called Why Video and Why LifeSize. So firstly, of course, every presentation that is about video conferencing starts about the ice business. Now, it's particularly relevant, by the way, if you're in Boston, because Frederick Tudor was a Bostonite. And do you know, I've given it away already a little, do you know who Frederick Tudor was?
I know who Frederick Tudor was.
Right, there you go. So Frederick Tudor was an interesting man. He was the man who invented the ice business. So in the 1820s, he realized that people would really like to experience ice in drinks and to keep medicines cold and obviously to keep things like meat cold. And he went to a lake just outside Boston, whose name I now don't quite remember, Welham Lake, but I could be wrong. And he would break up ice out of it, put it on boats and ship it around the world. In fact, initially he shipped it down to Savannah, Georgia and New Orleans, and about 66% of the ice, so 2/3 of the ice would melt before he got it there. And that was a fairly inefficient system, fairly obviously, and the people were so inexperienced with ice. In fact, most of the people who lived in Savannah, Georgia and New Orleans had never seen ice before in their entire lives, and they didn't know what to do with it. So he got it all the way down there, and they got it off the boats, and it all melted within 24 hours. People tried to store the ice in things like salt, because that's exactly what you do with meat. So we're like, you idiots, you put ice in salt? But people just simply didn't have any experience of it. Now, the reason I bring it up with Henry Tudor was he was a darling of the Harvard MBA set in the 1930s. I don't think they had MBAs, but they called it the management things, and he was known as the Yankee entrepreneur. The reason he matters is because Frederick Tudor made a ton of money. This ice, by the way, in the end, he got his system perfected where he only lost 6% of the ice between the point where he dug it out, and in fact, he ended up plowing it out of lakes in Boston. And he had all these patents. The fellow who worked for him technically had all the patents, but had all these patents around ice supplying. And there was a shop in the Strand in London that had a yard cube of ice in the window, and it was so clear that they used to hang a newspaper behind it and people could read the newspaper through the ice. The ice went as far as Calcutta and Madras in India. And you think, well, so what? Well, the point with Henry Tudor was he made a ton of money, he had a fantastic business, and 15 years after someone worked out how to manufacture ice on site in factories, his business was over. And this was a man who didn't believe that human beings would ever be able to make our own ice. Let's have our next slide. So we call these things accession events. So sometimes something happens that completely replaces the technology before it, to the point where the previous industry just dies completely, and dies in a way that the previous guys, however intelligent they were, simply never saw coming. Frederick Tudor was a perfect example of that. By the way, he died before the world went to manufactured ice. And interestingly enough, by the way, none of the manufactured ice organizations made it to making refrigerators. If you know, by the way, what's going to replace refrigerators, then probably keep it to yourself, because I will steal your idea, because it's $1 trillion idea if you have it. Maybe a replicator. You won't need a refrigerator or a cupboard with food in it, or any freezer, any of those things if you've got a replicator, if it works well. Maybe we end up printing our food, I don't know. And that's not entirely unreasonable. They're beginning to grow meat, after all, without having to make it into an animal. And you can print blood cells and skin, so perhaps that's the way it will go. I really don't know the answer. That's beyond I'm a video conferencing expert, not a replicator one. But it proves the point, right? Let's have our next slide. Next one, right? The wheel, the single simplest machine in the entire universe. My family were pretty wealthy at the turn of the 20th century making wheels. Now, so you never thought on a day like today you'd learn about wheel manufacturing and ice farming, but hey, I try and make it a little bit more interesting than bits and bytes about video. So wheel manufacturers, what they used to do was rent the carts with the wheels on to people, and they were wheelwrights. And what they didn't manage to do is understand that steel wheels with rubber tires on cars were replacing their cart wheels. And in fact, even if they had seen it coming, what could they possibly do? Because no one was going to put a wooden wheel with a steel rim on it on a car. It doesn't work. And they weren't really in the wheel business. They were in the wood business, or perhaps they were in the finance business. So organizations need to understand what they're really in. Now, if you turn around to my family in 1910 and said, what business are you in? They would have said wheelwrights. And by the way, the carts are only about 15% of the cost. The real cost of a cart is the wheels, because they're very hard to make. But the reality is they weren't in that business, or shouldn't have been, because they were going to lose. So they may have decided they'd go and do something else, like financing, perhaps, because they already had a finance business, effectively because they were renting these carts, or they were in the high quality wood business. I don't know the answer. And by the way, by 1930, they were destitute, living in King's Cross, a part of London I wouldn't go to even today, let alone then. Let's have our next slide. So, we've only got a small audience today, so let's see if we've got one in the audience. We typically have at least one. Who in the room had a Motorola Razr in 2005?
My wife loves her Razr.
Perfect.
Little pink one.
Little pink one, perfect. So they're exact, right. So I did a little video on this internally recently, and I asked people, if you have a Motorola Razr, could you bring one and just leave it on my office desk? And I came back a day later, and there are 37 of them on my desk. Right? Who knows why? I mean, what are people doing? Keeping them because they might come back? They're not coming back. But the funny thing is, if I got in a time machine and went back and saw your wife in 2005, and I said to her, so I've got the world's greatest phone from 2013 in my pocket. What's it like? Now, realistically, she probably would have said, be the size of a credit card, the battery will last a month, and it'll be indestructible. Because after all, that's what the Motorola Razr was doing, right? It was the smallest, lightest, strongest, best phone. But the reality is, I would have actually turned around and go, no, the best phone in the world in 2013 is twice the size of your Motorola Razr. The battery barely lasts a day, and if you drop it, it's $500 to replace the screen. And you would have looked at me and went, and that's progress? But it is, and I've got two examples here which I'm about to play you, which are less than 9 months apart. One of them, the first one's the Motorola Razr advert, and the second video is the world's first Apple iPhone advert. So let's have a look at those.
Hi. Hello, Moto.
So, say you're watching Pirates of the Caribbean. Did somebody say calamari? The closest would be...
So what have we learned? We've learned skinny Europeans are cool. We've learned flip phones are history. And we've learned that Apple reinvented the phone. Because suddenly it wasn't a phone anymore. It was a TV, an internet device, a map. In fact, for only 2 seconds in a 30-second advert did they even show it making a phone call. And I thought that that was transformative. So what Motorola did was effectively, immediately, their product was suddenly the best wooden wheel in the world. And the Apple iPhone and smartphones generally totally destroyed that. And we are in the process of doing exactly the same thing with video conferencing. Hence the reason we're calling it smart video. So let's have our next slide. So we do change the criteria by which video solutions are measured. And I'll explain why in a second. So we needed to analyze first, what business are we in? We're not in the video conferencing business. We're in the human connections irrespective of distance business. And there is a fundamental difference. In the same way that BMW do not make cars. BMW make ultimate driving machines, and that's personified, as it were, in a 1200 GS motorcycle or a BMW 335. They happen to be the personifications, and we will continue to change what we do as the technology changes, but we do know what our story is. So, if you think about it, back in 2005, when we launched the world's first LifeSize room system, we redefined human connections irrespective of distance in the sense of the quality of the overall call. The quality of the overall call was very, very close to this even though that was back in 2007. What we've done now is revolutionize the way that the people interact with the technology. Because if you think about it, one of the big problems with video conferencing has been, until now, that the user experience is very little different between what we use now over IP networks and what we used 10 years ago over ISDN networks. You had an endpoint or a device that interacted either with another device directly or with some infrastructure in the middle of a network. And in the ISDN days, it would dial up this other device and it would use DTMF to dial or to communicate. Just like your wife's Motorola Razr talked to the AT&T network through DTMF. And if you could remember what the voice connection was or how to fast forward a voicemail, you could say #6* or whatever the buttons were. And if you happen to remember, you could communicate in some way. But there was no question about when your phone was on the network and when it wasn't. If it had a dial tone, it was on the network. If it didn't have a dial tone, it was simply a box that sat in your pocket. And the bit that mattered was that it was as small as possible and always available. What smartphones did was revolutionize that to the point where the phone ends and where the network starts is redefined, or more importantly, blurred to the point of irrelevance. So if you've got a smartphone today and you use Google Voice or you use Siri, for example, well, where's Siri live? Is Siri in your phone or is it in the network? What it really is irrelevant, right? You don't care anymore where any of this stuff lives. And what we've done with video is the same thing, because we think this whole idea of having infrastructure in one place and endpoints in another and things like MCUs in endpoints that you can use because it's easy and convenient, and that's why people put MCUs in endpoints. Well, that and the cost of the infrastructure is so high that most users would rather have an MCU in their endpoint because it's easy. I can keep adding calls. But the trouble is, as soon as my MCU and my endpoint's not big enough, then I have to go and use an MCU in the cloud. And the MCU in the cloud has a totally different user experience than the one I'm used to. And the users don't care. And they don't want to know that, well, I've changed the toggle button on the view, but when I had the call and it was a four-way and I used the MCU in my endpoint, it acts entirely differently than I would use the MCU in the cloud. So why did we do that? Well, we did it for numerous reasons. We did it partly because when we first started LifeSize, there were no hardware or any MCUs that could do high definition. And secondly, we did it because as soon as the hardware MCUs did come out, they were incredibly expensive, $10,000, $12,000 a pop for each bridge port for an MCU for high definition. Let's have a next slide. So what we decided to do is two things. We needed both of these components to work together for this to be effective. We had to create infrastructure that was scalable, and the only way to do that was in software. So a year and a half ago, we launched the UVC platform, and we've added a bunch of applications, which I'll talk about in a minute. And that means it's VMware or Hyper-V based software environment, which means that almost every customer's IT department will already have an understanding of it. And then we simply make video conferencing an application that runs just like their Exchange server or their SAP instance or their Oracle instance or any number of other apps they already run. So the IT department's happy. It means we can bring the costs down of the infrastructure dramatically because we don't have to build dedicated tin. It makes it easier for the client, not only because he can host it themselves, or they can go to someone like Amazon or Rackspace or whoever their provider is and say, you host it for us. And you can't do that with hardware infrastructure. And perhaps most importantly, it means that you can buy what you need. If you need 3 bridge ports or 13 or 72 or 93, whatever the number is, you can have that. When it's in hardware, you have to buy 6 or 12 or 24 or 48 or 96 or some other. It's like buying eggs. But instead of each egg being 27 cents, it's $10,000. And we knew that that was a problem. So we created that part first. And then with the launch of the Icon product, which I know Leah will go through later, we give you a remote control that gives you all the access to that infrastructure without the user having to know where it lives. Because finally we've broken this barrier of I've got an endpoint and I've got some infrastructure. No, you haven't. You've got an endpoint that accesses infrastructure, but it's entirely irrelevant to the user where that power lives, just like Siri or Google Voice on your phone. Let's have a look at the next one. So UVC gives us a whole bunch of applications, and I know Leah's going to go into some of these in detail after I've spoken. So for example, you want link integration, you can have that on the UVC platform. If you want management, you can have that. In fact, you can't not have management, we give it to you for free. You get firewall traversal and border controlling, you get multi-pointing, you get streaming and recording. And as of yesterday, you get mobile solutions on there as well. We've had mobile solutions as a separate device for a while, but now our mobile solutions, whether on iOS devices or Android devices, Mac or PC, are all now available as part of the UVC platform. So why does all this matter? Scale is the simple answer to that. Now, if you're Goldman Sachs and you say, well, I've got $500,000 worth of hardware infrastructure and it's fine, that's great. But the reality is most customers start with audio, which is free, go to web, which is near enough free, and then it's $150,000 to get into the video game, just to start. And that's too expensive. The gap between what they've done before and where they want to go is too big to get over. As a result, they end up doing nothing. Now, because of the way that we can scale down to tiny numbers, we can do some really interesting things. In fact, let's have a look at our price list. That's the LifeSize price list now. Because you have an endpoint. If you want to add dual displays to it, it's a software upgrade. You want to add multi-pointing to it, it's an upgrade because it sits in a server in the middle, but the user accesses all the power of it through a 6-button remote. That 6-button remote, by the way, it's totally intentional because we looked at many, many remotes and went, you know what no one's ever said? Oh, look, it's got more buttons than the previous version. That'll be easier to use. Right? No one's ever said that in the history of time. I'll let you, after this demo, you can play around with a remote and you'll notice one thing. The most important thing you'll notice, Justin, is as soon as you start using it, you will not look at the remote control anymore. Not after about the first minute. And you could never say that about any remote control that's gone before it. You could absolutely say that. In fact, it's more like the remote control on an Apple TV. In fact, an Apple TV remote control has exactly the same infrared sensors as that one. Just saying. Where do you think we originally came up with the idea? So next slide. So let's talk about the N+1, N-1, right? If you're talking to clients, one of the biggest problems I've had in the 20 years of video is they look at it and go, yeah, it's great, but it's so expensive to get into that we want to start small and then scale up. Well, there's two problems with that. One, the barrier to entry to have something useful to an organization is typically so high that it becomes a real barrier to get into the game. And secondly, if they buy something small to start with and they grow later, there's all this legacy stuff. They all end up with MCUs in endpoints, for example, which turn out to be useless when they go and put a hardware MCU or a big tin MCU into the middle of the network. Well, that isn't true with us because, simply put, you start with a UVC server, which the client would almost certainly already own or could rent from someone like Amazon or Rackspace for very little money. They can try the products for 30 days, any one of the applications, or in theory, all of them at once. We'd recommend one at a time. And then they can get a feel for it before they go any further. And as the old joke goes, as a client said, well, if I like it, can I keep it? No. If you pay for it, you can keep it. And it means that you've got the opportunity to experiment. So from your point of view, as someone who's talking to these clients, you can start very small. You can start for well under $20,000 for a 3 or 4 endpoint opportunity with some infrastructure as well. And you can turn around to that customer and go back to them every 60 days and say, have you tried streaming and recording? Have you tried link integration? Have you tried management? Would you like another endpoint? Would you like dual displays? Would you like 1080p? All of these things are things you can keep going back to them with. So you plant lots and lots of acorns and then you grow the account. And that's something that as an industry we've not been able to do until now. And that's why we think this stuff's revolutionary. So 3 major things have changed with this. Capability, usability, and cost. Capability. Instead of putting more and more and more stuff into the endpoint, we're moving away from that model. We did it to start with because, as I described earlier, you couldn't afford big tin MCUs or they simply didn't exist. But now we get all the power of having an MCU and an endpoint, but it physically lives somewhere else, which means the capability of the endpoint can become more sophisticated but less expensive, which means it can scale and you can get into the game more easily. Usability means that there's no line now between, well, what's possible in my endpoint and what's possible in the network. I simply use it and I forget as a user completely as to where all those things live. In fact, we say to customers, if they ask, does your endpoint have an MCU in it? We say yes. I mean, it doesn't, but in the same way that your smartphone doesn't have a 6-way audio bridge built in, but you can make a 6-way call on it, you never even think where all the calls come through. And then cost. And the cost means not just in the endpoints, which are much less expensive than they were a few years ago, not just in the cost of the infrastructure either, but in the cost of managing and owning all this stuff. Because previously all these customers, if they bought more than a few endpoints, suddenly needed a video conferencing expert in-house. And it cost them a lot of money to buy it, and it cost you a lot of money to sell it, because you had to spend 6 months to a year educating the client on all the technology. Well, that's not the case anymore. You simply turn around to them and say, here's your infrastructure, here's your solution, run it on hardware that you already own. So, that changes the world. Now let's look at what everyone else has been doing. So, about 2.5 years ago, we were running TI processors, as was nobody else was. We were running super duper high-end mega TI parts, and they were wonderful. Nobody else had them. And our machines, if you've seen our machines versus high definition products from our competitors from 2 or 3 years ago, those devices were physically much bigger, generated more heat, had more fans in them, and all of those would indicate we were far, far more efficient than than they were at that time. And that was great. But 2.5 years ago, TI came to us and all our competitors and said, here's a new super duper mega chip. And you guys probably want to put this in your video conferencing system. And surprise, surprise, we said, yes, we do, as did everybody else. So in some senses, it's a completely level playing field now. Us and Polycom and Cisco and Radvision and everybody else who makes a hardware platform, we're all on a level playing field. We're not entirely, because microphone arrays, cameras, I/O, all those things make a difference. And we do have advantages in there. We're the only manufacturer, for example, who makes their own cameras from all the way from sensors to PTZ mechanisms. But what really mattered was the interaction between the endpoint and the infrastructure, that whole smart video concept that we've been talking about. And none of the other players decided to go that way, or thought about it perhaps. I don't know what their reasoning was. So what they did was use the same user interface they've had for 10 years and put it, or similar user interface than they've had for 10 years, not quite the same, but they still live in the world where you have a DTMF device interact with big tin hardware infrastructure. And we think that's fundamentally flawed. What they've done is create a better Motorola Razr. And what we've done is create a smartphone. And we think that makes a fundamental difference to the way people are going to use this. And that is the end of my prepared remarks, and I appreciate you spending some time with me on that.